Sara Blaylock
Hi.
has just joined us. Hello, Sara.
Hi there, Lynette. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. And I'm looking forward to today's conversation. Before I get just started, I just want to remind everyone that Busch Hall is our virtual space to reimagine art and identity through the lens of the Busch-Reisinger Museum. And we are very grateful to our fabulous German friends of the Busch-Reisinger Museum who support this conversation series and so much of what we do at the Busch-Reisinger. And before we begin, the Harvard Art Museums acknowledge that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people, and we at the university strive to honor this relationship. And so I am thrilled to welcome Sara Blaylock, who is assistant professor at the University of Minnesota, Duluth, and whose research addresses experimental art, film, and visual culture of the German Democratic Republic during the 1980s. And you may have seen some of our posts previously on Sara's work, including an exhibition that she curated together with Sarah James at the Tweed Art Museum called Antisocial Art, Experimental Practices in Late East Germany. And we are here today to talk about that, but also to talk about Sara's new book, which is called Parallel Public. I'm going to ask Sara to hold it up for our audiences. Thank you. And really, Sara, you know, I'm so looking forward to this conversation today because for me, you not only touch on so many of the artists who, you know, I've been thinking about and wanting to learn more about. And of course, your research is really diving into so many archival resources and firsthand artist interviews. So it's just a wealth of information. But you also provide us with a context. And I'd like to also really, in some ways today, focus on that rather than, get into the details of the book, because we also can't show any of the fabulous images that you speak about. I would just like to start by actually taking a step back and asking you a very general question. So you say at the beginning, this book rewrites the history of experimental art in East Germany. And I would love it if you would share with us how you do that.
Oh, thanks so much, Lynette, and thank you for the invitation to talk with you. It's always a pleasure to interact, and the work you're doing at the Busch-Reisinger is exciting. It's nice to be, doing whatever I can to bring some information to you and your research. The rewriting part. So when I began looking into this material at this point, almost 11 years ago, the vast majority, aside from one exceptional catalog, Art of Two Germanies, co-curated by Stephanie Barron and Eckhart Gillen, among others, was the only material that was in English. And that, of course, was that catalog had been translations of texts from German into English. And the majority of the texts on East German art are really, let's say, encyclopedic, right, and exhaustive, right, written by people who were a part of the scene and so perhaps somebody like Klaus Loerser, who was an extraordinary film historian, and his book, Strategien der Verweigerung, just lays out every single detail of this scene, or Paul Kaiser and Claudia Petzold have this exceptional book, Bohème in der Diktatur, and those books are absolutely fundamental to my understanding, right? The access that they bring to images, right, and also to description, to firsthand accounts, and what was needed is something written in English. And something that identifies the value of this work for an art historical visual studies audience, right? So people in the United States in particular, right, or English language speakers, certainly those in Germany also. The politics are so much different in Germany, right? Those kinds of, the legacy of the Cold War has very much defined how the subject has been written about.
Yeah.
Those original books are, defensive isn't the right word, but they're exhaustive because there's such a common trope that nothing happened in this place. And when you look at these books, it's clear that a lot happened, right? And so my book, The Rewriting, is trying to explore, feminist aspects of this, spontaneity, DIY culture, things that I've always found interesting in art history, trying to add an analysis that interprets the work through languages that make sense to the things that I'm reading and studying otherwise.
And how much is that also related to your teaching?
Oh, well, here I have a bunch of my students in here, so that's great. In the teaching, so one of the things that I lay out in the book is the need to offer some context, sort of start out with people's assumptions about East Germany, right? The presence of secret police is a big one, so I attack that in one chapter. Or the kind of ideas people have that in this context there was so much censorship and oppression that if people made work, it was going to be very angry and frustrated and underground. And I do that in the teaching too, right? So I spend a good deal of time setting up, well, what is socialist realism? What is abstraction as well? What are those debates that really informed the Cold War division culturally? So we dive into those very messy aesthetics and politics debates that really defined the 1930s. And I spend a long time setting that up because most people are aware of the necessity, the interest in abstraction in the United States. Very few people in my experience of teaching are aware of what socialist realism was, what this alternative pathway for that utopian idealism of modernism, how there was that alternative. And then, of course, how just like abstraction was co-opted easily into patriotic symbols of the United States or into bathrobe, like rugs and things you can put on your wall, right? Commercialized. Socialist realism also really fell apart. And yet, the connections between the money, the funding that the state put into the arts, maintained into the 80s, so much that even by 1989, like performance art is being paid for by the government in East Germany, which is something that I know interests anybody who explores experimental forms of art in the United States, where that kind of funding is just non-existent.
Well, and I think it's something, it struck me, you used a word there in that context, sort of surprised me. You referred then that turn to performance-based art was inevitable. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, because so much of your argument turns, I think, so in such fascinating ways on where is the funding coming from, and artists working both within and pushing against, right, the state-sponsored art forms or the state-sanctioned art forms. So you really move us away from, and this is, I think, how most of us initially learned to think about East German art, was in these categories of official and unofficial, and what you are doing, and what a number of other colleagues are really tackling now. It is to sort of just get us out of that binary, because it wasn't really helping us understand this work at all, and what these artists were doing.
Yeah, so I think that also comes back to your initial question about the rewriting, which is something at this point I think I just take for granted, but it's true. Most people think of those dichotomies, the official, the unofficial, and in fact, what I've tracked through this book, and I very deliberately used examples of artists who were trying to find ways to get funded, right, or to have some kind of legitimation through working in the art schools, joining the Union of Fine Artists, or even collaborating with a public project in some way so that there is some kind of presence, right? I was just talking with a friend yesterday about how the uniqueness of some of this work is that it actually did have a bigger audience than just sort of a cadre of interested people. It actually could be seen by the late 80s in free German youth clubs at art schools, in the annual exhibitions that took place. And this, coming back to your question about the inevitability, which I say in the introduction, as you remember, is that it seems as though there was so much of an understanding of how to make bureaucracy function for oneself, that if people were willing to put in the legwork, right, and just demand that their art forms were taken seriously, to, for example, with performance art, to demonstrate a history of performance art in East Germany that dates back to 1953, to connect it also to experimental forms of art from the German avant-garde, and kind of draw in saying, well, this is not an aberration, it's actually quite sociable, right? Like this kind of work, this kind of multimedia practice has been going on here. It's not like they're just coming out of nothing. And also, again, that kind of understanding what legitimation meant, which was, getting in the union, getting in major art exhibitions, and just holding on to that, and working really hard to ensure that those outcomes would actually happen. Mm-hmm.
So in some ways, they're having to write their own prehistory in order to demonstrate that this is part of a larger legacy, which I think is interesting in thinking about, one of the other things that your book does so well is also thinking about how do we think about it now, or what is sort of the place of, you also say, do we say art in East Germany or East German art? I mean, I myself am sort of unclear sometimes, because I've been told, by some artists, they don't want to be described as an East German artist, as obviously there hasn't been an East Germany for decades. So in some ways, it sounds like what you're describing is that in the bureaucratic kind of process, they had to actually set themselves in some kind of national, larger sort of national culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there was also a need for East Germany to appear legitimate, right, across the world, and especially sort of being able to translate this work to the West. And which isn't to say that they were only oriented westward, but there was definitely a kind of understanding that what was going to happen in East Germany to artists was going to could potentially be a source of delegitimization. And the interesting thing is that if you were a political activist, it was a very different story than if you were somebody who was making unusual artworks with your friends and trying to find a way out. But there is a kind of desire to be relevant that I think supported this work. And there's also, so that question of, is it East German art in East Germany? I always say art in East Germany because of what you say, that folks don't want to be defined in this kind of context universally. And it's almost comes back to this question today of, well, if somebody is born in Germany but has lived so many other places, or has always oriented their work outside of their national origin, that conversation is clearly relevant. I think that one of the things that interests me a lot about this work is that I write this, that I do believe it absolutely took place in East Germany for very specific material reasons. Not least of which the fact that there weren't a lot of people in East Germany that were doing this kind of thing. And so there was a great kind of, not to say, I don't want to idealize it, but a little like kind of a camaraderie, right? Or like, I will go to your event, you go to my event kind of thing. So a permanently active community, as one person described it to me, or an emergency society, as Christoph Tanner calls it. but there was at the same time a real desire to separate oneself from nation, right? So there was a desire to not make work that would be codified as East German, right? As any particular nationhood. And there's a few exceptions, like the auto perforation artists certainly allegorize their experience, but also do much more than just talk about East Germany. Like their work is about gender and class. But it's clear to me that for these artists, there was a very conscious effort to be to exceed the context, right, and to be visible, to be legible outside of East Germany, outside of the politics of culture in that country as well.
And that's something too that you point to, you refer also to these multiple identities, right? So that, even if we're looking at the work of, an artist who's working in the 1980s in East Germany, that's not only is their work not only interested in that context, but also from today's perspective can open it up and open up the way that we think about East Germany, at the time. I mean, I think it is very important to note, and maybe you can explain that a little bit more, but, that we're talking about, very specific, that what you're talking about is the late 1980s as opposed to other moments. So maybe you could just kind of, very briefly sort of explain sort of what has changed in that particular moment that has made the work that you describe in such depth, not just possible, but what what is it kind of coming out of?
Yeah, there was, and that's, there's such a long legacy of people after the early 1950s striking out and trying to create larger publics for their work through whether that be through the creation of collaborative projects, galleries, publications, things like this, and the laws that could be railed against a person became much more flexible in the 1980s. And this is not just because of, that East Germany had, economic concerns, right? Political concerns, tension with the Soviet Union, but also because people in bureaucracy, right? Sometimes you get somebody who's much more flexible, right? We have this context ourselves, right? Like, that somebody is in a civil service job, in this case in the Union of Fine Artists, because they believe in art. And there were art historians, somebody named Klaus Werner, for example, who in the early 1980s lost his position for pursuing the kinds of projects that somebody like Judy Lübke, who would eventually be invited into the Union of Fine Artists as an autodidact, so a self-taught art historian, were doing and didn't get in trouble. So in the late 70s, early 80s, the risks were a lot larger. By the late 80s, the kind of awareness that the government had of or cultural authorities had that these projects are not going to go away, and that maybe the best move is to, as in the case of Judy Lübke, actually invite this person into the fold, right? Or the Union of Fine Artists in general was starting to invite people who hadn't been trained at art schools, because there was a gesture toward figuring out a new way to define art and socialism. We don't see how that plays out, because the wall comes down and everybody leaves, right? Like there's not as much of a need to create this kind of community in a place that has so much opportunity. And I can talk about that as well, but
we should definitely talk about that. So let's talk about sort of the the end and the how artists actually do respond to that. I mean, obviously in very different ways, but the way that you describe it is, we're getting this kind of this build up, certainly these kinds of shifts that you again describe as sort of inevitable coming out of what has gone before, and then there's no East Germany anymore.
So there's Well, so by the late 80s, there were about 30 different publications, right, being produced, what sometimes we call samizdat, but that term, talking about the Soviet Union literatures, is a little bit different than what's going on in East Germany, because the audiences were pretty small for those publications. But by the late 80s, the major library in Leipzig is collecting them, so clearly aware that there's some cultural value to these objects. And by the early 90s, there's essentially just one, and it's actually still being produced. It's Uwe Wanke's Entweder Oder. And he really feels committed to the practice. It's not about East Germany, right? It's about creating thematic content, print material, photography. But one person told me that one of the reasons that he believes that these all fell apart is because they were luxury goods. Like once you don't have the context of necessity, of the enormous amount of effort it took to create these kinds of publications, to distribute them, to gather a cohesive argument, that there were, when East Germany opened up and then dissolved, there wasn't the same kind of need. And fascinatingly, the trajectory of the publications can kind of track this arc that I mean of inevitability or flexion. Because if in the early 80s they were publications like Anschlag were taking any kind of submission, by the mid 1980s they were selecting, right? So they weren't just taking anybody. And by the very end, 88, 89, there were arguments being made in these publications that hadn't existed. So there was a stronger understanding of kind of theorizing the scene, like making a theory of the film scene, or talking about what is and is not working in galleries. And that just, it makes sense to me to think about people wanting to go elsewhere. In that moment, obviously I didn't live it, and it's just been described to me as, well, I wanted to try something else, right? Here I was, I'd spent, my 20s and 30s in this context, and now I can do something else.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was interesting too. I wasn't familiar before I read your book with the work of Marina Toslanova. Yeah. And you mentioned that also at the end of the book, because you're kind of summing up in some ways, why is there still quite an absence in museum collections and in exhibitions of a lot of this work. And you quote her comparing the sort of post-Soviet condition to post-colonialism in the the sort of feeling that it left also with those who had been living and working in East Germany. And I was hoping you could say a little bit more about that, because it started to, it started to then help me to think about, that situation post-wall, sort of after a reunification in a dramatically different way.
Yeah, so in her book, What Does It Mean to Be Post-Soviet? She is really thinking about, and obviously we're seeing this play out right now in Ukraine, the ways that the Soviet Union kind of asserted itself, and not kind of, but absolutely asserted itself on contexts that had been self-sufficient, creating their own work, creating their own worlds. And that one of the reasons why Eastern and Central European art histories and film histories are really differently developed than those of East Germany is because of that pre-Soviet identity, right? Having to, or being able to return to it, but having also to kind of reconcile with this, many decades span. And in East Germany, the context is a little bit different because of, it's quite different because East Germany emerged as a response to Nazi fascism. So it's not so much that they were not a colonized, the comparison doesn't really hold with East Germany, because that was, there was an understanding among most people for many decades that this is something that had to happen, right? Germany had this this history that needed to be worked through. There were plenty of people who chose to live in East Germany because they wanted to create a different kind of Germany to follow and really identify with German culture and reframe that so that it leads not to fascism, but rather to more egalitarian practices. So what's been difficult is figuring out how to really work through that kind of very unique difference in the East German Cold War context. And at this point, there's plenty of interesting work being done, especially in Dresden at the SKD there, on ideas of, well, how do we think through East Germany's more global ability or interest in kind of recreating itself, and so I think that thinking about where the museum culture, collecting culture is going is even much different today than it was in November 2020 when I was writing that.
Yeah.
Just looking at some of the ways that people are starting to exhibit the work in Germany. Because it just was true that for many decades, the only place you would see work would be in former East German lands, and maybe it would be funneled through these defensive strategies of, well, this wasn't all, art made out of frustration, or there wasn't just censorship, or there was a great move in the mid-2000s toward thinking about women, feminist artists, or women not necessarily who identified as feminists, but women working through their past. Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's interesting. I mean, just thinking about it from the perspective of today, you also mentioned that, many of the early supporters are really pushing for, locating it in a very German context. And of course, these are the questions that, we're asking now at the Busch-Reisinger Museum as we think about, questions of national identity and how, I've spent a lot of time thinking about certain kinds of continuities throughout the 20th century, right? So not just, obviously in, during the Cold War period, but, throughout the Nazi period and the Second World War. And so it seems to me like it's a place where now, at least there is a kind of grappling with, as you lay out in the book with, where does this identity sit? And basically what I came away from it thinking is, it's constantly shifting, right? It doesn't matter sort of where, you decide to pick up the work, of many of the artists that you talk about, right? There's kind of no, there's kind of no holding it down and sort of pinning it, which is the sign, I think, of, really great art. I mean, you also mentioned that many of these artists were part of the so-called, third generation, or those sort of born into it, and that in a certain kind of idealism about art was a part of what they were thinking. And I think that's actually something that really kind of comes across as this belief still in the power of art. I mean, I don't know how you feel about that also afterwards, and whether that's, something obviously they're able to retain when they're no longer working in an East German context.
Yeah, I think that's I think that still is part of a lot of people's conviction, is a very uncompromising commitment to their craft and to making fascinating works of art. Like Rainer Gross of the Autoperforation Artists has an underground museum kind of archive in Berlin that he basically maintains with his partner, and it's kind of, anybody can come and join. Gundula Schulze-Aldawi has such an interesting story because she took these exceptional photographs that I feel like I will never stop wanting to think about each of these phases of what she works on. In the book, I talk about her work, her images of labor or of aging or of nudity, and she, when when the Venda happened, she was given the opportunity to move to New York City to work with Robert Frank, and I write about this in the book, that she quickly realized that this competitive quality of the arts, the kind of opportunity to make a living as an artist, which was just not a reality in her context of the GDR, was not what she was invested in. So she moved to Peru, where she moved to Egypt, and then she moved to Peru because she wanted to kind of be around. I mean, it's hard to really summarize what she said, but she wanted to be around very non-commercial contexts. And that for me, when she described this, seemed absolutely an outcome of having been in a context, or been a young person, mm-hmm. when art was, the emphasis was on, well, how do you, for her as a person trained in photography, how do you represent the world around you? How do you advance people's dignity through photography? And then also, right, in the experimental scene, and she definitely is the person who bridges both, what is official, what is unofficial.
Yeah. Also in her choice of medium, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly, right. So using photography, which is, such a, an easy access point to a lot of people, right? So she was super interested, and she told me, I didn't want to photograph my friends, I wanted to photograph my neighbors. And so she had this experience of knowing that her photographs would record real work existence, right? And at the same time having the experience of showing them within these groups of people that really, banded together and wanted to, yes, make art for the purposes of bringing people together.
Well, and I guess there we're sort of at the title of your book, which we didn't discuss, but the parallel public itself. And I think that's really, it's an incredible contribution, Sara. And I feel like we could keep going, but in the interest of sticking to our format, I think we'll wrap it up here and just say so much more to learn from you, and look forward to future projects and future opportunities to engage with the incredible work you're doing. So thank you for joining us on Busch Hall for our conversation.
Well, and thank you. And I know some of the projects you have underway, and I'm extremely excited to see those and to hear more about how you're going to frame this stuff. So I'm eager to keep in conversation.
Well, it's a work in progress. And thanks also to your students for tuning in today.
Yes.
Everyone else, this was almost a record turnout for our live conversation. So you're very popular, Sara. So thank you again, and take care, everyone, and tune in next month for the next live conversation that we'll have on this in this format. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynette. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.